In this clip, what we want to look at are the different forms that music takes within the service. And depending on which particular tradition you come from, maybe some of these will be familiar and some will be less familiar as we go through these different concepts or different forms. And of course, the most well-known form of church music is the hymn. And so it's really the hymns that we know very well. And these are the hymns, often in terms of our tradition, the Methodist tradition, which has got the strongest tradition of hymnology, comes from this process here. People like Charles Wesley, even John Wesley wrote some hymns, but then also people like Isaac Watts and Francis Ridley Havergal. Lots of these old writers who wrote during the 18th century through to the modern period. And so what is a hymn? A hymn simply is a song of praise to God, a song of praise to God. But we need to remember that hymns change over time. Is that part of the process of a hymn, part of the reason for the hymns to be there was a tool for teaching. Now, some of the first hymns that take place start in about the 3rd century AD. Now, that's a long time ago, 1700 years ago, we start seeing the first hymns begin to develop within the church. They're not overwhelmed. There's not a huge number of them. Often they don't have a rhyme at the end as some of our hymns have today. It's not so much in terms of the poetry as much as the music, and the music as a vehicle to teach. And so the hymns in a lot of those places did teach. For example, the creeds, the ancient creeds of the church were put to music. And of course, music in that way becomes a vehicle for learning. And so the hymns are used as part of that vehicle. If you look at Charles Wesley's hymns, what Charles Wesley realized when the Methodist revival began to happen in England was that a lot of the people that they wanted to reach out to, a lot of the people that they wanted to evangelize, actually had very, very poor literacy ability. So they couldn't read the Bible for themselves. They certainly couldn't read theology for themselves. So what best to do then is to put the theology into the hymns. Teach theology, teach the Bible through hymns, through music. Of course, the trick that they used for that was that even though the people wouldn't have known the content, what they were making sure of, and Charles Wesley made sure of, was that they would know the tune. In fact, Charles was prepared to use the tunes that came from the local bars, the local bar tunes. He then took those tunes and gave them new words. So you can see that straight away there was an importance then of the concept of tune as a way of promoting these concepts. And so the hymn was really trying to promote theology, was trying to teach theology to an illiterate community. But of course we don't stop at hymns. There's also things called songs. And so we can have the songs, or sometimes we call them choruses. Now, these really develop after the Pentecostal Revolution, and we'll talk about that a little in another clip. But one of the things that happens here is that instead of teaching through the choruses, what we're trying to do is to worship. And so sometimes these songs are called praise and worship songs. Some of the songs even get used for children because often they're simpler than the hymns. They use simpler language, they use simpler music. And so they're used in children's ministry to be able to encourage children to sing and to participate within the life of the worship. So we have songs. But those are the two most well-known parts of church music, but there's far more. Of course, for a huge amount of the life of the church, we've had choir anthems, where the choir has actually led people in worship. That instead of the participation of the congregation, often that participation was limited to those who could sing. And often to sing in various harmonies. And so we end up with the harmony that we'll call the SATB, the soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. That concept of being able to use harmony to encourage the mystery and the wonder of worship and of coming together in God. And so the choir plays an integral role in developing that concept of mystery. Often the choirs, particularly in the Middle Ages, sang in Latin. And so you see that Latin influence, which fills these basilicas, but often doesn't involve the congregation. They may listen, they may be awestruck, but they're not participating to quite the same level. There's other forms of music as well, also that begin within that medieval period and move on into even the modern today, some less so. And one of those is called chant. Now, chant starts with under the Pope Gregory, and that's why it's often called Pope or Gregorian chant. It happens during that period of the Catholic Church. But chant was where we sang without accompaniment, no music, no instruments, just using the voice as the instrument to present that particular concept to people. Chant continues to work today and continues to be used today, particularly out of some of our religious communities like Iona and Taizé. And so there's chanting as using a way of connecting devotionally to God, where not only would the cantor or the person chanting do the chant, but in fact sometimes would elicit a chant response from the congregations as well. There's also the service music. Now, service music are used often in what we call high liturgical churches, churches which use music as the interludes or as the connections or as the introductions to different parts. And we've dealt with some of that when we looked at the concept of liturgy, the Kyrie and the Sanctus and the Agnus Dei. All those are the different little bits of service music that help to flow and to weave together the concept of what a service is about and help to draw people into the mystery and the wonder of what worship will be. Two other parts of music as well are the Psalms. And the Psalms were used extensively, right from the time of the early church, in fact, all the way through from Judaism, all the way through into the modern church today. There's still modern churches today that refuse to sing hymns that are written by human beings or rings that are just written for the secular type environment, but rather music that is written for the Bible itself, or through the Bible. And so the book of Psalms was put to music and is sung as part of the musical tradition of that particular church. Finally, the last one I want to talk about is instrumental music. And the instrumental music developed as we began to use instruments again in church. And of course, the king of all those instruments being the organ. And that as the organ began to become part of these basilica environments, part of these big church environments, the concept of using instrumental music, of creating a mood, of creating an environment in which you can worship. Obviously, the instrumental music then can play an extraordinary role, and still can play one today, both in terms of playing at specific times in a service, maybe during a prayer, maybe during the concept of life. As you can see, there are many different forms of music that can be used within the service. And what we need to do is to have a connection with each of those forms, because there might be an appropriate time when we can move away from the usual 4-hymn sandwich into something more creative and connected in the way in which we come to worship.